Well, education as a word and as a concept is about what people do to you, and learning is what you do to yourself. So learning is necessary, but there might be other ways than an education system as we know it in most countries. Well, the future of education as a system really depends on parents and government putting more value on what their children learn versus the discipline of tests and going through grades. We've created a system that segregates children by age. So 6-year-olds study with 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds study with 7-year-olds, and you march through the system. And yet we know for a fact that people learn more if they're age integrated, but that's harder. So for the convenience of the system, we create grades in the sense of classes year to year, and we create grades in the sense of scoring people. So in order to measure, we use these very artificial systems that, in my opinion, kill many students, kill a lot of creativity. So we've got to stop testing, stop these tests, and have children become more engaged in their activities. The way you learn for the first 5 years of your life is actually a good model for the next 10 years of your life. I think learning happens automatically. Children are wired to learn. That's why we learn to walk and talk, and we learn common sense, and we learn many things. So I think that the best way to achieve learning is to continue that kind of exploration, experimentation, making things, trying. In the case of computer programming, it's an approximation of thinking. So when kids engage in that, which is not the only activity, but that particular activity allows a child to basically teach a computer, and as they're debugging a computer program, even though nobody's telling them this directly, it's a very good approximation of learning. Well, lifelong learning simply means that your life is more integrated, and it's not always in stages and compartments. And in general, the digital world, the internet, has made life much more integrated. I'm fond of saying life is like an omelet now, but it used to be like a fried egg. There used to be a crisp boundary between the yellow and the white, and this is school and that is work, this is home, that is office, this is play, that is not play. They were very distinct. Now they become much more integrated. And in fact, some children engaged in making and learning through making are accused of playing. Somebody will look from the outside and say, well, that's not serious. They're playing, they're not learning. In fact, they're learning in the most profound way. I don't think you educate children for something. I think what you want to do is make sure that children learn learning itself. And while that sounds abstract and, sort of very wishy-washy, it's not. It's a very important aspect of learning, because you can learn math by being told and learn to hate it at the same time, and in fact not have any passion anymore. You lose the passion for exploring things that have numbers in them. And I know adults who say, I'm bad at numbers. They're not bad at numbers. They just had a very unfortunate experience with mathematics at an early age, and they had maybe a more comfortable experience with reading and words, so they think to themselves as they grow up, I'm good at words and I'm bad at numbers. And that's totally artificial. Well, in very loose terms, science is discovery, technology is invention, and education is the ability to move between them in all aspects, not just scientific and technical ones, but the inquiry and the observation and then using what you believe to be evidence to do something else, these are general rules of thumb about life and learning and navigating through a world where we know we can't know everything, for sure. In fact, we can't even know everything in a small area anymore. And then worse, we know that whatever we know, it's going to change. And the biggest change that's happening right now is in change itself, that it's changing much faster. So change is changing, and it's you see all these things happening, and what you want in your children is creativity, flexibility, imagination, all sorts of things that are in fact considered a little external when you're measuring grade scores and trying to have a disciplinarian type of education system. What I am trying to do now is to make connectivity a human right, have it be part of human rights doctrine. And the reason that now is the right time to do that is because you can connect everybody at such a low cost that it's more about rights and opportunity than it is about a commercial or business enterprise. So we have seen a change where you can establish that as a baseline for everybody. There are two parts to that. One part is to get people to advocate it and believe it, because most people will say, yeah, that sounds like a nice idea. But then when you step back, one of the things about human rights is they're free. You don't pay for a human right that I don't have, and if you're rich, you have it, whether you're rich or poor. So it's more like streetlights and roads. And while those aren't human rights, they're civic responsibilities. And I don't want to dwell on the difference. What I want to point out is when we go out and we use the street or the road or the street lights, we don't think of it as something that we were able to pay for and hence use, even though it is part of a tax system. So, in my opinion, the worst thing that has happened to public education is private education. Because private education sucks out of public education the best people, the families who care, the best teachers, and so you're left with the residue. You're not left with a powerful opportunity to do something for everybody. And there's an interesting, it's not a coincidence, there's an interesting fact. If you look at the countries who do the best, and again, these are tests, you look at the countries who do the best, they are the countries with public education. It's Finland, it's Korea. It's not the countries that have these fancy. If I had to rebuild a country, I would look at the lessons we have learned from social democracies. Because capitalism is not democracy. And there's some funny, again, coincidences. If you look at these lists, which you may or may not, I'm not sure I even believe in them, but the richest country, the happiest country, the most productive country, you look at those lists. And the top 10 countries, and go back, look at them. Over the past 10 years, at least 8 out of 10 countries are socialist countries. They're social democracies. Switzerland, Finland, Norway, Iceland, they're always in the list, they're always at the top of the list. And that's not by chance. One of the important aspects of education, in my opinion, is to eliminate competition. Competitiveness hurts learning. And parents are competitive about their kids doing well. The kids are competitive to get scores. And you go to a country, like I'm going to pick Finland, and there's no homework. There are no exams. The parents aren't in some competitive situation, and it's more a collaborative education. Now, Korea does it exactly the opposite at the expense of, in a different way. So they both can work, but I think you have a long-term society that is more creative when you do it the way Finland does it versus the way Korea does it. Yes, the ministries of education around the world, their constituency is actually not the children. Their constituency is the teachers, perhaps, and the parents, perhaps, but it's sort of set up upside down because you've created a system that I don't believe, and this is worldwide, this isn't unique to it, you've created a system which is probably not the right one. Interestingly, very poor countries and rural parts of countries that have one-room schools that are viewed as an example of poverty, that may be a better model of education. But it's hard to change because of two reasons. One, we went through it and we survived. So if we survived, it can't be all bad. Some of us survived and knew how to ask questions, so there's a proof of principle in ourselves, which is hard to tell people there might have been a better way. And the other is, it requires a kind of dedication which doesn't necessarily happen in civic society. Over the past 30 years, pretty worldwide, there has been a devaluation of civic society and working in the public sector. While we don't say it explicitly, we have been telling our children for 20 years that the place to go is the private sector, be entrepreneurial, start a company, even if it's doing someone else's laundry, and again, we haven't said it explicitly, but only losers work for the public sector. And by public sector, I don't mean politicians, I mean the civic sector, which is most of the public sector. And I remember when I was young, working for something like the State Department, it was a great honor. It was a great nobility in working for civic society, and you could do it in many different ways. And we have to slowly but surely change that and not try and make everybody into an entrepreneur or a business executive, because we've tilted too far in that direction, and we have to go back and be more civic and more global, because nationalism is a disease and is another issue in terms of sort of global progress. Well, school as a place, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with having a place where you spend a certain amount of your time at whatever age engaged in what you and I would call learning. How that is then managed, how it's part of society, what is, how does it weave into the fabric of life is very different than what we have today, because today it's really run by people who have very specific goals for the children, and they basically have told the children and their parents, trust us, this is good for you. And if you trust us, and you realize it's a little bit like medicine that will not take effect now, but it'll have an effect in the future, that's very different than, for example, in later parts of education, that's not how you learn architecture, or that's not how you become a musician. They're different ways of doing that have to do with making and doing and thinking by making, which is not limited to just the creative arts, is limited, I should say unlimited, to almost all kinds of learning. Well, the compartmentalization of learning has two aspects, both of which may not be true. But one is that people believe you have to learn A before B, and then you have to learn B before C, and usually that's not really true. You have to understand, perhaps, even just intuitively, something to maybe have a bigger picture of something else, but there isn't as much of a sequence as we believe, that you go through it sequentially. And the second aspect is that we compartmentalize partly because it's easier administratively. So some kids engage very early in society. It could be as simple as delivering newspapers. It could be things that aren't, at first particularly complex. But it's also the case as we go on toward a life that will be somewhere between 100 and 150 years. When people live 150 years, suddenly you'll look at the first 12 years of education and say, wow, that's a very small piece. Maybe you should have 20 years of education. Maybe you should be, 35 or 40 when you graduate. So if you take it to that extreme, of course not. It'll become the omelet instead of the fried egg. And it can't just be that suddenly at 21 you graduate from university, or 24 or whatever age, and then you spend the next 125 years working, maybe 50 years of retirement, but it's just not going to be that compartmentalized. It's going to be forced to be more fluid just by the change in the longevity of people's lives.